I saw a little clip from an interview. It was from Anastasia Bendebury. I honestly don't know the full podcast. I have not listened to the whole thing, so I will not speak of the whole interview like this. But there was a clip that I caught that was really, really interesting, and I think it hit on something that actually left me meditating and thinking on the implications of all of this um, for quite a bit. And what she talked about was the risks of hyper personalization, which is really where we're going with a lot of this AI technology is how do we just completely personalize an experience to every single thing that matters to you? And what are the longer term implications we're not thinking about? And the example she brought up that really was a thought experiment for me where I started going, okay, as I think about this, as I think about human psychology, as I think about human behavior, as I think about, if you watch my video from earlier this week about kind of the implications from what does the Bible tell us about just who we are as a species and what are we vulnerable to? The example she used was, in the days when you went to watch a movie, companies paid millions, and in some ways they still do, but product placement was a big thing. And I remember that as a kid, you went and watched a movie, it's like, oh, they're drinking Pepsi, they're eating Doritos. And that was like the way you did marketing was product placement. And so it led to these massive, massive, massive brands because they had the money to just pour into it. And if you were eating any tortilla chip other than Doritos, you weren't cool because all the movies you just watched, everybody's chowing down on Doritos and drinking Pepsi or whatever, or the computer they have is an IBM. And so you got to have an IBM. And this, in many ways, shaped the culture and shaped the experience. But what she talked about is where we're going. And I agree with her on her assessment of where it's going. I think for me is kind of the just continued implications of it is she said, we're going to get to a place where everything you experience is going to be hyper personalized to you. So you may go watch a movie and the person sitting next to you may watch the exact same movie, but the products that are in that movie are going to be personalized. So they might eat sun chips for me. And if it's next to me, it might be salt and vinegar Lay's chips. I'm literally making this up. So, but you know what I mean? We're to the point where you're like, oh, in this one, they go to a restaurant and it's McDonald's, but for this person, it's Panera. And you go, huh. And what she talked about is the fact that as you start to do this, it actually fractures the realities we live in. And I think sometimes of some of the Marvel stuff I've seen, or even Spider-Man, the metaverse, and when you talk to people about kind of some of these crazy concepts. But ultimately, it seems really crazy until you start to think about this and you go, even in the world we know it today, we could almost create these little sub metaverses where you and the person next to you have the same experience, but it's not the same experience. And what kind of implications does that have? Now you get done with the movie and you go talk about the movie and you kind of like look at each other like, wait, did we see the same thing? Because you didn't see the same thing, but you did. You were there, you were present, you were watching the movie, you were watching the same movie, you bought tickets to the same movie, you went and saw, but it wasn't the same movie. And what does that mean? And we actually know this doesn't end well, um, because if you look at, we've seen this trend in news and social media. If you look at how people get their news today, instead of everyone getting it from the same source. And so it's kind of this shared experience. Everybody watched the moon landing. And so there was this experience that was created by that. I still remember watching the planes hit the Twin Towers and being in the cafeteria of the college I was at, and we all watched, and it was almost this shared experience of we all saw the same thing. We saw the same headlines. We saw it, and it created some unity around that experience. And if we start talking about this hyper personalization on a level where, going back to the Twin Towers example, you're both watching it at the same time, but what you're seeing isn't the same thing. What does that do to us? And what we've seen just from news and social media is it separates and isolates us from one another, because all of a sudden you're trying to find the people who have the same algorithm, the same things you have, and only kind of connect with that group of people because they have the same shared experience. And talking to this other person who doesn't have that same experience, suddenly they're not just like a different person who thinks slightly differently than you, they've experienced the world radically differently than you. And so you can't even have a conversation anymore because your realities are completely different. And just watching the patterns of what has happened in human history recently with some of this stuff, I think her cause for concern is legitimate. And I think we need to be keenly aware that this is coming. And already we're in an age where the person you talk to may not have the same shared experience as you, even if you were in the same environment. Oh, hey, we were both on Facebook today. Did you see this happened? And you may have that conversation with somebody who goes, yeah, and can you believe that? And this other person goes, yeah, what? Wait, what? What are you talking about? No, it's this. And suddenly that turns from a situation where you're talking about the situation in community with one another to you're arguing about the realities you've both experienced and lived in that are real. And what does that do to us? And so I think we need to just have an awareness that this is where this is going. And if anything, I think this should drive us to be more connected to one another and more gentle and more gracious and more willing to ask questions and listen and dig beneath the surface rather than just reacting to the emotional reaction we have or what we see or what presents when we initially have a conversation with someone. Because the reality is, their experience of that may be completely different than yours, and it's no less true or accurate. It's just completely different. And I don't know that we are currently equipped to handle that very well, at least not what I've seen today. So I think that's something that we need to be mindful of. And I think, if anything, it goes back to what you hear me say a lot about: be slow to react, slow to anger, and quick to listen, because this is only going to get more complicated and more difficult. And I think more reasons why we need to spend time talking to people who aren't part of our same tribes, engaging with people who think differently than us. And because I think it's going to be harder and harder to find your tribe. And I think that's going to become very isolating. And so if we start to gravitate towards, well, I only like to be around people who think and act and behave exactly like I do, it's going to become nearly impossible to find those people, because it's going to be so hyper personalized that person's not going to exist anymore. Not that they ever did, but it's only going to exacerbate this. Well, I am this. This is what I am. This is my experience. And that's changing. So, um, yeah, I'll leave it with that. I'll probably have more to say on that as this continues to develop. But definitely food for thought. And again, just in a call to action for us all to be patient and more willing to engage with people that have different experiences, because they have them today and they're going to have wildly different experiences tomorrow.